College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, President Lowe, Dean Dalglish, distinguished guests and panelists. On behalf of College of Behavioral and Social Sciences and Dean Greg Ball, who couldn't be here today, I want to welcome you all to our Spring 2016 Sadat Forum. We're also very pleased to co-sponsor with the Philip Merrill College of Journalism. The focus of today's panel discussion is a bit different from those we usually have, but it addresses a matter of the utmost importance: the consequences of cyber spying on U.S. foreign policy. We're reminded almost daily of just how important these issues are. And we have an eminently qualified panel: General Michael Hayden, Professor Dana Priest, Professor Shibley Telhami, here to discuss them. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. Dr. Telhami will give a formal introduction to the other two panelists, but let me take a quick moment to introduce him, even though we know him so well that he needs little introduction. Dr. Telhami is a full professor in our Department of Government and Politics, our first and only holder of the Anwar Sadat Chair for Peace and Development since 1997. He's an internationally recognized scholar and international relations, and an expert on the Middle East. Dr. Telhami is a frequent contributor to major news outlets and a regular guest on radio and television news programs. His best-selling book, The Stakes, America and the Middle East, was selected by Foreign Affairs as one of the top 5 books on the Middle East in 2003. His opinion polls in and about the Middle East provide an ongoing source of important attitudinal information regarding this significant region of the world. He's also one of our best teachers. He's received too many accolades for me to list here. Dr. Telhami, I'm honored to have you as a friend and a colleague.
Thank you.
We appreciate the opportunity, as I said a moment ago, to co-sponsor this Sadat Forum with the Philip Merrill College of Journalism. And I now have the great pleasure of introducing Professor Lucy Dalglish, the Dean of the College.
Thank you, Dr. McIntosh. I'd like to extend a welcome from Philip Merrill College of Journalism to you and Dr. Lowe, General Hayden, Dr. Shibley Telhami, and our John S. and James L. Knight Chair of Public Affairs Journalism, Dana Priest. The two of them have worked very hard over the last several months to put together the program today. It is a privilege for Merrill College to be invited by Professor Telhami and his BSOS colleagues to participate and co-sponsor today's program. On behalf of the rest of the faculty and staff at the College of Journalism, thank you so much for making us feel welcome. About 3 years ago, when our Knight Chair in Public Affairs Journalism became vacant, the Merrill College faculty carefully considered how we might make our public affairs program go to a new level, taking advantage of being at a level 1 research institution inside the Beltway in the world's journalism capital. We evaluated what a journalism program at the University of Maryland could provide in education and research that no journalism school could duplicate. We looked at the expertise found on this campus that we could leverage. We looked at the university's research agenda and the relationships that already exist with federal agencies. We discussed, most importantly, what we think are the biggest public affairs stories of our day. It became very clear that today's biggest public affairs story involves global security, national security, and cybersecurity. but very few journalists understand these issues, much less understand how to cover them. The University of Maryland, as I said, is uniquely positioned to educate tomorrow's journalists on how to cover these incredibly complicated and intractable problems. We believe our research and professional outreach will position us to be a world leader in national security journalism. Our graduates will be able to explain to their audiences what the national security problems are, potential solutions to those problems, how taxpayer dollars are being spent to address them, and also importantly, how all of these issues impact freedom of expression worldwide. So today, we could not be more pleased that our night chair, Professor Dana Priest, is participating in this important program, and that General Hayden, one of the world's leading experts on intelligence gathering and terrorism, has graciously agreed to participate. Thank you very, very much for coming to the program this afternoon. And now I'd like to introduce the president of the University of Maryland, Dr. Wallace Lowe.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and thank you, Wayne. Let me just very, very briefly add my welcome to all of you, the University of Maryland community, to have a conversation. Listen to what promises to be a fascinating dialogue, and then the opportunity for Q&A with the audience on this very, very important topic of cyber espionage, and I assume related issues of cyber sabotage, cyber warfare, and cyber theft. This forum is sponsored by the Sadat Chair for Peace and Development, and as you know, Shibley Telhami hosts this chair. And this is a chair that was established several years ago in honor of the late President Anwar Sadat of Egypt. And under the guidance of Professor Telhami, the Sadat Chair has brought world leaders, as well as national leaders, policymakers, to discuss issues of development and peace, not only in the Middle East, but around the world. So again, thank you very much for coming, and to Professor Priest and General Hayden, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much, President Lowe, Dean Dalgish, and Dean McIntosh for your generous introductions. Let me introduce my speakers quickly. Neither one of you needs introductions, but I want to welcome you, General.
Thank you.
Personally. I know you have been incredibly busy of late. You're always busy, but now with all of the things that are happening, especially the Brussels bombings, you've even become busier than usual. I don't think that there's anybody I know who's been more accomplished in the national security area than you have, who've served the United States in that area more.
Thank you.
And I know that those of you, you all have, you know his biography, but certainly served as director of the National Security Agency, as director of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, as the first principal deputy director of National Intelligence, and is also a retired Air Force four-star general, currently a principal at the Chertoff Group. So we're great to have you here. I also want to add that General Hayden has a new book. It's called Playing to the Edge, American Intelligence in the Age of Terror. That book is actually available here for sale, and he has graciously agreed to stay and sign copies after this event for those of you who are interested. I know I'm buying two, okay, not just one. Also, I want to add a word of gratitude to you for what you have said of late in answer to the suggestion that the United States should torture people, or that the next president is going to give orders to the military to torture people. And you've said we are a country of law, and the military is obligated not to obey such orders, unlawful orders coming even from a commander-in-chief. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm not the only one, I think, who says that. I think this is something that is needed.
That's very kind, but when I answered that question from Bill Maher, I thought I was saying something like Newton's first law of physics or something, you know? Something that everyone knew, and so I'm surprised some folks were surprised.
Yes, but it's the unusual thing about our current presidential campaign is that such principles have to be restated. And thank you for restating them. I also want to introduce my colleague, Dana Priest. Dana, you've been a wonderful colleague, great addition to the University of Maryland. Dana, as you know, is currently the John S. and James L. Knight Chair in Public Affairs Journalism at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism. Those of you who have been reading her for years in the Washington Post, she is one of the best in the world in covering national security issue. Two-time Pulitzer winner, been a finalist 3 times. She has covered many of the issues related to CIA, related to other violations in government, and has written 2 books, at least 2 books, Top Secret America and The Mission, Waging War and Keeping Peace with America's Military. So thanks so much for joining us. And so let me start with a general question to you, Dana. And the general question really is on cyber spying, period, where we are now. Mm-hmm. I know that there's been a huge expansion since 9/11. It was a big tragedy that America faced, a shock to the national psyche, and we know the sort of things that government did in reaction on foreign policy that was visible. For a while, what was happening on intelligence gathering was not quite as visible. And since then, we've learned quite a bit about cyber spying that our government has been engaged in, that the general obviously knows a lot more than you or me about. If you can just give us a little bit of a background on where we are on that, what we know, and sort of what are the key issues and the challenges, that would be great to start with.
Just very briefly, you know, we have 2 different roles in society, and so I get to play my role now, which is the outside critic, if you will, the watchdog role, and that's why I'm beginning by setting the framework, which is obviously in the first decade after 9/11, the intelligence community had to change so much about what it did, and the good news is it got so good at some very important things that it didn't know how to do before, namely how to find individuals in a particular country, how to find them, how to target them, how to kill or capture them. And that required both the CIA and the NSA to undergo a major transformation in the way they had been doing business in the last 40 years. That's really great news for all of us. They know how to find bad guys, and they know how to find the bad guys that we want them to find. And in fact, if we look at what works in intelligence, it's these very focused teams that know the family histories of terrorists, they know the lineage, they know the language, and they're best at finding them. But I would say, and this is my critical hat on, that in the second part of the 21st century, that perhaps looking from the outside, the intelligence world has lost a little bit of that focus on targeting terrorists. It's not to say that they still don't have that as a top priority, but when you look at some of the controversies that have come up, the bulk collection I'll put in this, and this is just not me, there are people in the intelligence community who have questions about whether that's the most effective use of resources. But also, I would say that looking at Europe today, literally today, you have to wonder what happened to the liaison relationships, the bilateral and multilateral intelligence relationships that really grew up and deepened after 9/11, where we were sharing so much with Europe and we had at least begun to put in place, with our help, a fusion of intelligence among the European countries. You read in the newspaper today that that's one of their fundamental problems today. And so one of my questions would be, what happened to that evolution of the deepening of relationships where we could get to the point where we're reading that they aren't cooperating anymore? And I'm also hearing that, they're asking us for more intel that they're not getting. So that's my analysis, but really my question.
Well, you know, as a follow-up with that, I mean, is there? I mean, we are hearing, obviously, particularly after the Brussels attack, about the problems in coordination and intelligence sharing. And has that gone? Has this become a problem? Or this has always been a problem.
Well, I mean, it's always a challenge because, I mean, intelligence is about acquiring wisdom secretly, and, you know, the secretly adverb there is frames certain approaches. But that said, the intelligence sharing problems that have been starkly displayed in the last 48 hours are not American. Right? We, frankly, are the glue for European intelligence sharing. Right? In fact, you want to get a secret around Europe? I mean, if you're a European service and you want to make sure everyone in Europe knows, tell the Americans. No, we unfortunately, what should be a community of equal sharing and a common enterprise rather than transactional relationships of final product, what should be a community is not. It is a hub and spoke relationship, and we are the hub. Now, I'm put the Five Eyes out of it. That's a special relationship between ourselves and the other 4 English-speaking democracies. But when it comes to the Europeans, they much more readily share with us than they do with one another.
Each other.
Now, there are lots of reasons they share with us. One is we're good, and we got lots of stuff, and everyone wants to have a positive relationship with the American intelligence services because, I mean, we dwarf everyone else in terms of size, in our globality, in our technological sophistication. So everyone is happy to share with us because they know you put a nickel in, you're getting $1 back, right? But they don't have that incentive structure going around this way between and among European states.
But that's why I would ask, you know, you said it's not our issue, it's a European issue. But knowing that we played such a central role, it seems that it is partly our issue.
Well, no, okay, now, actually, there's an argument for American exceptionalism, all right? We have a special responsibility here, and I actually agree, all right? Because of who we are, not some innate God-given right, but we are at a certain point in history. We have certain capacities that other nations don't have. We actually are a distant power, and so therefore people are more inclined to trust the distant power than they are the neighbor power. But we do, Dana, we do. We had something called SIGINT seniors inside the NATO alliance. I didn't start it. Link Farr did. How long does that go back, Bill? 20 years before I became director? 1983. Yeah. 83, 84. It was designed to get the NATO nations who actually can do this pretty well, signals intelligence, all right, the intercept, get them all together into a common enterprise. The Americans started it, the Americans sustain it, and the director of NSA is still the chairman of that group. And we Americans try to push broader cooperation amongst our European allies. The trajectory is unarguably positive, but the pace was so slow that we developed new phraseology for the timing. We said this is moving forward in NATO time units, okay? Okay? It's almost glacial. So could we do better? Sure. Should we have done more? Probably. But fundamentally, to the degree there is sharing, it is the byproduct, maybe the direct product of American efforts. And again, it sounds self-congratulatory. I don't mean it. I understand we have a unique role in history at the moment. So it's actually between and among the Europeans. Now let me make it more complicated. All right. So we go one off with the DGSE or with SISMI or FRA.
French intelligence.
Sorry, French, the Italians, the Swedes, the Norwegians, the Danes, and so on. All right. The Europeans have done something destructive of their own security. And this has to do with the European Union. Bear with me here, I'm not criticizing the Union. But in the division of governance in Europe, all right, matters of commerce and privacy have been given to union institutions for advocacy and resolution. Matters of security are retained by the sovereign states. right? And so what happens is you got a bunch of people in Brussels, not the Belgian city, the Euro capital. You've got a bunch of people in Brussels who are making decisions about privacy, okay, with no inherent interest in the trade-offs between privacy and security. In fact, they don't have a security dog in the fight. The only dog in the fight they have is commerce and privacy. And so they make broad rules for the union that the security services in here now have to live with. Now, if you think the Euro crunch is creating torque inside Euro structures, you're right. If you think the immigrant crunch in Schengen is creating torque inside the Euro structures, you're right. This one's coming down the pike. This is Euro-derived rules derived by folks who have no responsibility for security that the folks who do have responsibility for security now have to live with. So frankly, that has actually gotten in the way of American-European intelligence sharing, but even up to and including with our historic friends, the British.
Intelligence sharing is obviously a problem, and in this case, the case of Brussels may have been a problem. But to me, as an observer, not someone who's following this as closely as you are, I'm looking at it and I'm seeing this unbelievable expansion of cyber intelligence since 9/11 on a scale that has made a lot of people uncomfortable because of the intrusions into private life, and certainly in America and in much of the world. And we see it on a global scale. Certainly ours is the biggest, but there are a lot of other people who are doing it and doing it on a large scale. And yet
not doing it on our scale.
No, not doing it on our scale. That's what I'm saying, doing it on their scale.
Yeah.
And yet we've failed. I mean, we didn't prevent Brussels. We didn't prevent San Bernardino. We didn't prevent Paris. So what explains that? I mean, it is when you look at the huge expansion for which we're kind of debating about, privacy versus security, and we're still not able to do that. So what's going on? How would you explain that?
Sure. Well, number one, the things you mentioned did not take place here. All right? They took place in Europe, and I've already told you they're operating under different rules. Belgian law enforcement is not permitted to do cyber espionage. Belgian law enforcement is not permitted to use wiretaps in their legal system. All right? So back to they're operating under different rules.
But we are.
Yeah, no,
Right.
we are.
We are in their backyard.
Well, wait a minute now. The proposal here then is for the Leviathan, American espionage, to be as responsible for Belgian safety as it is for American safety?
No, but I mean, let's face it. ISIS is a threat, not just to Belgium and Paris.
Oh, no,
it's a global threat to us.
I get that.
So
But
to the
this was a
extent that
threat-
we're
this was a-
observing a global movement,
I got it.
I mean,
I understand.
All right.
I understand. But let me unpack this a little bit. Number one, you can make a case that there was no cyber exhaust, no communications exhaust that would have revealed this. We don't know that to be true yet. We don't know that there was any communication out there that would have cued people. All right? This may have been done face to face. In fact, pretty good instinct given how it went down, that it was done face to face. And there's certainly no command and control structure in Raqqa that's sending out cables saying today's the day. All right, so it may not have been preventable through digital or signals intelligence kind of espionage. So you just don't know.
Dana, on this issue yourself, I mean, obviously, when you look at the failure, I mean, you've observed this. There've been many successes, tremendous successes. Let's not forget that. No one will, will deny the things that have been prevented by the scale of intelligence that we have. But if you're looking at it in terms of practical terms, of the sort of things that are taking place, how would you explain the failure?
My question really would be, if we're spending time eavesdropping on some of our allied leaders, which is part of what came out in Snowden documents, aren't we also if you're the Belgian station chief of the CIA, and you know that these neighborhoods exist because actually it's an open secret, wouldn't part of your job be to figure out who you should be using NSA, so we can use our capabilities?
Yeah.
So would you expect that we did in those hotbeds of radicalism?
Sure, I would think that the United States did what it could to protect itself and recognizing this as being a global movement to protect its allies. But again, one needs I guess one needs a sense of proportion as to what's possible and what's not possible. All right? And if the Belgian services present in Belgium, culturally and linguistically more agile in Belgium than we will ever be, all right, empowered in there, talking about their own society, did not detect something, I don't think it's an automatic to say, how come the Yanks didn't know? All right? I mean, and then when you get to some of those things inside the United States, and you're right, we Americans have kind of a Manichaean view of the world. All right? You're either protected by the Fourth Amendment or you are not. And if you are not, and your communications have information we believe help keep Americans free or safe, game on. We're going, and by the way, that is not about guilt or innocence. All right? That is not about, oh, you can only do this to bad people. Bad people, good people, not particularly useful distinction for us. We're looking for communications that give us data that keep you free and safe. But now when you turn that internally, when you turn it on to people who are protected by the Fourth Amendment, so let's leave Brussels for a moment and go to Boston. All right, and you did have a horrible event in Boston. And after that happened, we found out that the Tsarnaevi were out there surfing the web and going to jihadist websites. And now the great outcry is, oh, for God's sake, how much money you guys get a year? How come you didn't know they were going out and visiting jihadist websites? To which I then respond, interesting proposition. So you want the National Security Agency monitoring the web activity of American citizens and legal permanent residents. Is that the plan?
Well, it's certainly not what I'm suggesting, but
No.
It's certainly not what I'm suggesting, but I'm suggesting that I hear it's being done anyway.
No, well, from whom? No, don't let that lay. That puppy is not staying on the floor.
Can we go?
What? that is, and that's part of the issue.
Yeah.
All right? I'm looking at some NSA veterans, and we actually began this migration pre-9/11. We have overused the terrorist threat to justify what we're doing. Badly overused it. But everything we're doing now that people are going, ooh, what about that? We had underway pre-2001. If you go to the testimony I had in front of the House committee in April of 2000, and I'm sorry, I'm taking up too much time, but let me just put this on the table for everybody. In April of 2000, I testified in open session to the House Intelligence Committee because we knew we were making a major muscle movement with regard to how America does this sort of work, Professor. And here were the elements of it. Number one, there wasn't anybody who ever gave a damn about the civil liberties of the Soviet strategic rocket forces. All right? When we were out there intercepting those signals, everyone was saying, good on you. By 1999, 2000, the equivalent of SRF, the Rocket Forces Communications on an isolated network, were terrorists, proliferator, trafficker communications, coexisting with your emails and mine on a single integrated telecommunications structure. And so there was no way NSA could do what it did for you in the 20th century in the 21st unless it was allowed to be on the networks where your stuff was. One muscle movement. Second muscle movement, we were drowning in volume. We were being overwhelmed with the volume of modern communications. And so that old discipline about, let's pick up this one, this is an interesting frequency, stay on that freak, we'll get what we want, no longer could work. We were being submerged by volume. Pre-9/11. And so the answer to volume was to quit fighting it and make it our friend. And the technique by which you make volume your friend rather than your enemy is bulk collection and metadata.
All right.
And so we testified in April of 2000, pre-9/11, if you want us to play the game, we're going to have to play it this way in the 21st century.
No, I understand that, and obviously there are assets. This university is actually big on big data, and we understand it. And you know, we do it in various fields, and we understand the assets that come out of that. And you have to do it at some level. Yeah. But the question is whether we're investing too much and too little in human intelligence. And this is what I want to get to Dana to talk about, because, I mean, I'm telling you, for example, I'll just give you an example. In 2004, 2005, I was asked to serve on a bipartisan commission by the Bush administration. It was mandated by Congress on public diplomacy toward the Arab and Muslim world. And I co-drafted the report. And when we did the scanning of our diplomatic efforts toward, in the Middle East particularly in the Arabic-speaking place, we found if all the State Department assets, that's the State Department that has all kinds of assets theoretically on this issue, of all the people in the US government, in Washington, as well as people who are in embassies in the Middle East, there were only a handful of people who are fluent enough in Arabic to converse on Arabic television, a handful of people. And I could tell you that I go to missions across the Middle East all the time, being hosted by a number of people. And I see resumes before I arrive of people who say their Arabic is one of their languages, and they can't say 2 sentences when I sit down with them to speak in Arabic. So how am I going to trust those people? And I assume that that's also a problem we have in intelligence if it's there in state. How are we going to trust that these people are even translating what you're getting from the communications correctly, not to mention having intelligence on the ground? And is the problem, such as the Brussels problem, more a problem of human intelligence than it is a big data problem?
So that's a great question, and it's kind of a mirror image of what I said. There may not have been communications retrievable out there that would have tipped this off in any way that was actionable, which then leads you to human intelligence as perhaps what it is you need. Look, in my experience, if this little pyramid here I'm forming in the ether in front of us is American intelligence, all right, what we get on a daily basis. The base 60%, these are cartoonish numbers, but they're roughly right, all right? If this is everything we get, the base 60 is electronic surveillance, all right? You can wake up in the morning and know if the world is normal or not based on your SIGINT, all right? It's that constant, it's taking the pulse, you know when the heartbeat goes up, because you've normalized, in the literal meaning of the word, you've normalized everything. The top 20% of that pyramid on any particular issue, the exquisite boutique as opposed to the massive industrial. The exquisite boutique information is human intelligence. And then in between, you've got a whole bunch of imagery and what we call measurement and signals and signatures intelligence and so on. That's roughly the pyramid. And so you're asking somebody like me, I need all parts of the pyramid.
Right.
All right? Now, I do believe, all right, and that's probably an important point, because of the way you, the big you, the however billion you we are, all right, and the way we've behaved with the telecommunications revolution, this chunk down here got really big in the last 15 years, because things you used to keep in a safe or a desk drawer, or at least in your wallet, you decided to put in your phone, all right? And when you extrapolate that globally, okay, the director of the National Security Agency looks like that Mr. Burns character on The Simpsons, you know? Excellent. There is just so much more information that is electronically retrievable. So in the last decade, this chunk down here has gotten really, really big and more important and more valuable. With the march of technology, speaking of Apple, all right? Mm-hmm. With the march of technology, y'all are getting smart. And I don't mean you Americans, we don't work against you, but globally, everyone's getting smart saying, gee, I guess maybe I shouldn't have put my PIN number out there unencrypted. And so what's happening is that this part of our normal intelligence take is now beginning to shrink from what I think I can describe as an abnormally high level the last 10 to 15 years because of this abnormal circumstances where we all foolishly put too much in there. Right? And so what's going to happen, Professor, is that SIGINT piece is probably going to go down, particularly the content piece. The content piece is definitely going to go down, and which then means if the people you're spending all this money on to keep you safe are doing their jobs, they're going to have to expand the other parts of the pyramid in order to make up what will now be a shrinking proportion that we get from electronic surveillance.
So, to follow up on that, developing a larger and better human intelligence core has been at the heart of what every CIA director is supposed to have done in the last 15 years. I know it's hard, probably the hardest thing, But if you look at some of the reforms that are being undertaken now at the CIA, there are a lot of people who are worried that they are moving away from that as a priority in the way that it's been bureaucratically changed. Are you worried about that at all?
So the fine print, and Dan is absolutely right. First of all, we did expand it. George Bush told George Tenet, and then handed it on to me, expand the number of case officers by 50%, and we did. All right, so we did get expansion. We got the pick of the litter post 9/11. My last year as director, we had 160,000 people want to be a CIA officer. All right.
And how many became?
Yeah, that's a secret number. Good effort. Good effort. But obviously, it's a very small number.
Right.
But the point I'm trying to make is we expanded and we didn't lose quality. All right. So that's a good thing. I don't know that it's so much we've lost interest in human intelligence collection. In fact, I'm convinced we haven't. But just scratch one bit of surface off, Dana, and I think you've hit a really serious problem. Much of what we call analysis in the American intelligence community today is targeting. We are living the reality of being an intelligence service for a nation that has been at war for 15 years. And so the flaw is not that we're putting too much in SIGINT and not enough in human. The flaw is we're putting too much of everything into the immediate needs of the battlefield because we got young Americans in harm's way. That's virtuous that we protect them. But it is at the expense of the deeper, broader view that you should expect from the intelligence services of a global power.
Can I just, and I wanted to follow up on one other thing you said, just to make sure that I have it right.
Yeah.
If the terrorists who committed the bombings in Brussels and Paris had used, if we find that they did communicate electronically, would you expect that the U.S. collected that communications? Maybe they don't know they have it yet, but that they did collect it?
So that's a great question, and I thank you for asking it, all right? Because very often...
Because that means you're going to answer everything.
Yeah, oh yeah. It's very often we confuse things in our public discourse that people who actually do this for a living really distinguish. And so if you think of working the signals intelligence, the electronic surveillance thing, think of it as a funnel. At the wide end of the funnel is access. And then you go from access to collect, to process, to translate, to analyze, to report, to disseminate. You see the process. One of the difficulties we've had with the public debate, secrecy, privacy, security, liberty, and so on, is that the uninformed, all right, have taken the number associated with what you can access and turned it into the number on which you report. All right, and that is a horrible disservice. Number one, to how this is done, but it's also a horrible disservice to a fair understanding of how much privacy is or is not squeezed with regard to legitimate intelligence collection. So that it could be, Dana, that when we discover the cell phone in the next safe house, all right, and go, we never saw this critter before, you really do want to have collected at the metadata level a whole lot of information so that you can then say, well, I wonder if that cell phone's ever showed up in what it is I've collected but not yet done anything else with.
I was thinking much more of a much more discrete problem, which is we know ISIS recruits have a path, and a lot of them, a lot of sympathizers are located in certain places in Belgium, and we know where those places are. So wouldn't we have targeted those places for...
Look,
is that
sure, and I get the theoretical question, and I'll posit there are no legal restrictions for the United States to go target legitimate targets in a foreign country, even one that's a friendly foreign country.
Right. So do you think we would have done that?
But how hard is it for an enterprise headquartered at Fort Meade to have a God's eye view of all the communications entering or leaving Molenbeek in Belgium, when, of course, the Belgiques aren't doing it?
Are you suggesting?
I'm just suggesting that that is a technical and operational challenge.
Not as hard as the Fatah, though, right? I mean, you have.
It depends. I mean, in the tribal region, Brussels is a modern cosmopolitan city with an ocean of data flowing through it. Not so much in Merrill.
Well, let me take that just a little further because to the spying that we know has taken place, such as on leaders of friendly countries. But before that, I just want to say one more thing about the previous subject, which is the issue of human intelligence is not just about having operations and knowing what's happening next or having connection with people. But part of the problem, I think, is that in order for us to really get a picture of what's happening, you have to understand the aims of these organizations. So what is ISIS up to? How is it different from, and that's the stuff that I see very lacking in our analysis or information about it. And clearly that's something that's not going to get out
to
of
reinforce
the
my
negative.
point,
Yeah.
so much of our energy is in targeting for action, targeting for additional collection, or targeting to make sure he or she doesn't get on that airplane. It's all in disambiguation, which drives you in this direction, and you're saying we're lacking in that direction. I agree.
Now, let me get to this issue of spying on leaders of allied countries, and I understand obviously when we talk about cyber spying, it's not all for security. I mean, some of it is for security, some of it is for getting advantages in negotiations and political negotiations. Some of it is other countries do it for industrial espionage. So there are all kinds of reasons why people do cyber spying. It's not just for security. And obviously, a lot of these things that have to do with spying on leaders sometimes have to do with security for sure. But at other times, it's more about negotiating advantages rather than that. And so we know the episodes that have been reported of spying on European leaders, including Angela Merkel, that has generated tensions between the US and Germany. And we know that the president has said that he's instructed that we should stop doing that, although I don't think anybody's believing that we've stopped doing that.
No, we have. But the president didn't say, we'll stop doing that, until we decide to start again.
We stopped, but obviously there's been a report since that we continued to spy on the Israeli prime minister because there were fear that he was preparing for possible war with Iran, and nobody really wanted to and so forth. So that's clearly an issue, and I assume that everybody assumes they're being spied upon anyway. And I've heard comments that you have made in the past, which has said something like, I'm not apologizing for the activity, but I apologize for embarrassing some of our friends. And
I do.
So I want you to expand a little bit on that.
So the quote the professor was referring to is, we should be ashamed of ourselves for getting caught. I'm serious. We can debate whether it was legitimate or illegitimate to target a foreign leader, and I'm not confirming any of them, all right? But you can debate that. But you can't debate that if you're going to do this with regard to a friendly country, you owe them the respect of not letting that ever become public. And I mean that. In terms of this profession, you do certain things, all right? But you're expected to do them well. And if you can't do them well, if you do them clumsily, and you end up with the worst of all worlds, that's just bad tradecraft, and you pay too much in your taxes to these institutions to accept that as acceptable behavior.
And you're assuming, obviously, that Allah is spying on us.
Well, here's the story I was going to tell you, and here's the story I told in Germany, all right? At the time, I said that other thing. I said when Senator Obama was the president-elect of the United States, he had run his campaign on his BlackBerry, and we all saw that. And we all went up to him after the election and said, Mr. President-elect, you really aren't going to be able to do that as the president, all right? And he actually said on CNBC, it was almost like a Second Amendment bumper sticker. He said something about they're having to pry it from his fingers, right? And so we figured, okay, he carried Florida and Ohio. He's probably going to have his way on this. So what we said to the president-elect was, all right, can we borrow it for a day or two? And we took it up the street here and did some tightening, and we gave it back to him. Now, here's what I said to the Germans. I said, let me give you the backstory on what it is I just told you. By the way, that is a true story. I mean, I've told it in a flippant way, but it is what happened. And I told our German friends, let me tell you the backstory, all right? We just told the soon-to-be most powerful man in the most powerful nation on earth that if he used his BlackBerry in his national capital, his emails, his texts, and his SMSs would be intercepted by a host of foreign intelligence services. And we didn't rend our garments. We didn't feign moral outrage. We just simply were telling him, that's the way things are. This is what adult nations do to one another. All right?
Well,
if someone is reading your national leader's cell phone, shame on you.
Well, let me
By the
go
way,
on. Yeah.
the Americans intercepting the Chancellor of Germany's cell phone in Berlin is the least of the Chancellor's problems.
All right. So if I assume, if you're a foreign leader and you assume that you're being spied on, couldn't you use that also as misinformation?
Sure.
Let me just give you an example that I'm very curious to have both of you comment on. There's been a lot of reporting on particularly the Iran nuclear deal and the role of Israel in that, where the Obama administration initially assumed that the Israeli threat that they would attack Iran was just bluff because they're not capable of doing it. And that toward the end of the first Obama administration, the Israelis sent a lot of signals that changed the American calculation from this is a bluff to taking it very seriously. And it turned out, in retrospect, according to some of the Israeli reporting by people like Nahum Bernea and Yedot Ahronot, that in fact this was all part of a strategy to push the U.S. to intervene. Now, obviously,
campaign.
obviously, the American intelligence must have picked up the wrong signals, and so how does that, or at least there were signals that were designed.
Sure.
Yeah.
I don't know that to be true, that the Americans picked up the wrong signals and then thereby try to convince the political leadership that the Israelis were about to go to war. But you've reported on these sorts of things, disinformation campaigns.
Right.
We conduct them ourselves, for heaven's sake. And so a good intelligence service always has to be aware that they may be able to read certain things because they want you to read those certain things. All right? That's actually an argument for more collection. Okay?
Yep.
that is not an argument for shutting things down. That's actually an argument for going out and getting more so that you can compare it to a variety of things. So that if country X is saying this to country Y, you may want to see what country X says to countries A through N. Okay? Even though you may not be mad at A through N at all, because that's what you have to do in order to have a good picture. Look, I just have to be. The public debate about this, number one, gets wrapped too closely around, as you pointed out, Dan, too closely around justifying this on counterterrorism, and as you suggested, we don't need terrorism to justify this. This is what responsible nations have to do to be responsible governments and to protect their people. And so we do this for a variety of reasons. It has nothing to do with guilt. Okay? It has to do with, does that communication contain information that if we were to learn it, would make us a safer and a more free people. Back in the, John Deutsch, 80s, in the 80s, CIA suffered mightily because the political leadership said, you can't talk to bad people. We would suffer mightily in this decade if our political leadership directed, you can't listen to good people.
I want to cover.
Yeah,
I'd like you to comment on that for sure, and I also want to follow up with a couple of questions before we open up to the.
Well, as someone who covered intelligence, it was somewhat of it looked somewhat like a show that the Germans would be so upset about the spying on Merkel when the heads of state in particular know that this is a standard practice. But this gets to my larger point about secrecy. It does appear to be difficult to keep a secret these days.
It does.
It does. So, and having read your book, you constantly are asking the inner circle on various programs, what is it going to look like when it leaks? So the intelligence world knows that it's difficult to keep secrets. But I would even say beyond that, it makes it so much more difficult to get the public to understand that terrorism is global and that particularly our European allies. they've been able to bash the United States and not take responsibility for their own, lack of really trying on terrorism on their own territory, I think in part because we don't talk openly about the threat.
Well, no, I disagree. I think
And about how we try to counter it together and the various secrets that always come out and then always cause a backlash. The secret prisons, huge backlash in Europe. The Snowden documents, huge backlash in Europe that probably did, at least temporarily, affect the relationship.
Yeah, but your earlier point's well taken. There's a fair measure of theater involved in the response.
You don't think there's too much secrecy still?
No, I do. I say,
Okay.
I say in the book. But in terms of the European backlash, all right, there's a certain political compulsion that the European leaders got to be outraged. And then there's a certain political compulsion that our leaders got to say, I'm concerned about your outrage. And then after a while, everybody goes back to work, all right? So,
But it looks like that might not quite have happened in the European case.
Let me tell you something.
Safe harbor
Yeah.
legislation.
Well, again, no, safe harbor. You familiar with this? Okay, that's a reflection of the Euro community making decisions at the expense of the national responsibility. There isn't a country in Europe. There isn't a security service in Europe who thought that was a good idea in terms of their decision on safe harbor. All right, and it's because of that structural flaw. And I'm sorry to keep beating this horse, but this is going to be a big deal. We Americans have ugly discussions between security and privacy, liberty and safety. And they're ugly because people responsible for privacy and security are in the same room. And they're arguing with one another. The Europeans look very peaceful because they have the people in Brussels pontificating about privacy while the poor DGSE guys are worried about keeping Frenchmen alive. All right? And they don't have that constant conversation. Where were we?
Could you address, I mean, when you look back over the past 15 years, all the press revelations, all the miscommunications,
Right.
do you think secrecy,
No.
the IC should be a little more open?
Oh, I agree, absolutely. And it's not to keep the Europeans happy.
No.
It's to keep you happy. All right? Look, let me put the cards face up with regard to European outrage. All right? The only thing amazing about European outrage is their ability to recycle it about every 10 years without any obvious sense of embarrassment. All right? Let me tell you something I never heard on a phone call with a foreign leader. I've got some threat information, good friend. And he said, Michael, stop. Before you tell me, please tell me how you acquired this information before you let me know. I never heard that. Okay? And so they are quite willing to embrace everything we can.
Let me just change a little bit because I want to get a couple of more themes before I open up for questions and answers. One of the themes is continuation really of the other countries spying on other countries and us. I mean, obviously it's not just an American problem and they're not on the same scale, but it's emerging. Yesterday there was a report that a 23-year-old Gazan out of the middle of a little territory under siege hacked into the Israeli drone system and was able to download all the pictures and share them.
But the downlink's unclassified. I mean, that's not
fine.
rocket science.
But there are we know there's a lot of, I mean, there were huge reports about spying across the globe emanating from all sorts of sources. And we know it's a big one, and there are some countries that are doing more than others. But in your comments in the past, you have specifically said that if people were to ask you about where is the biggest challenge of cyber spying on the U.S., you answered China.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
But I've got to distinguish here, all right? I'm also on record as talking about the OPM breach, which our government hasn't quite confirmed, but I'll tell you the Chinese did it, all right? That's 26.5 million deeply personal records. Right? I'm on public record as saying, no shame on China. Right? Shame on us. We did not keep protected the personal information of 26 million Americans with security clearances. And I will add that if I had the opportunity while I was working up the road here to do the same thing to the Chinese, I would have done it in a heartbeat. And here's the punchline. And I would not have been required to go downtown to ask anyone's okay. This is what you do. That would have been an incredibly valuable target. So my point there is no shame on China. shame on us. The distinction I make with China is not that they steal American government secrets. They steal American government secrets. I blame me. My complaint with China is that they go after American industrial secrets. And then they use the power of a state, and in this case, a near peer state, the power of the state for commercial advantage. Right? They're not going after government secrets. Their definition of state espionage includes spying for commercial advantage. We do not. Neither do the other English-speaking democracies. Unfortunately, that about exhausts the list. Everyone else does spy for commercial advantage. But the Chinese do it on such a scale that my sense is that there needs to be repercussions for that grand theft. Not necessarily in the cyber domain.
Yeah.
They're doing it for economic advantage. So kick back in the economic relationship.
Yeah, I understand. Dana, I want to ask you a question because we as you know, you've read the journal's new book, and it's there, as I said, it's going to be out there for anybody who wants to buy it or get a signed copy afterwards. But he said something about you in the book, and
It was nice. I remember writing this.
And he said the following about you, and I want you to comment in part because it's really about the role of reporters. I mean, this is something that it's, obviously everybody has to deal with, and clearly a lot of the leaked information that we've had has come through reporters. Even the Snowden documents had to go through reporters ultimately to get disseminated. So, the role of reporters is obviously central here. And here's what he said about you. He said, the Washington Post's Dana Priest, of course, the University of Maryland as well, but that's another story.
Now.
Now, yes. Not one with high favorables at Langley. Okay, so there you go.
True.
Your reputation precedes you, Dana. Did not publish the locations of alleged CIA detention sites in her Pulitzer-winning series in late 2005. The agency argued that such a revelation would put the citizens of these countries at increased risk from the terrorists. She agreed.
Well, it wasn't. I wish it could have just been me, but it was actually my editors, because when the media discovers things that are classified, we take it seriously that it's classified for a reason, even if on the surface it doesn't look like something that the public shouldn't know about. And in this case, when I started putting these stories together, it seemed like something that was so unconventional to who we think we are as Americans, because purposely was there to skirt the U.S. court system, basically, so interrogations could continue. But when we get that sort of information, because we don't have prior restraint, thank goodness, in this country, I think it puts more of a responsibility on us to at least try to get a conversation going with the intel world. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you'll just get a no comment, and I have some pretty absurd examples of that when I was left to figure out whether, do you really want me to put the names of X, Y, and Z in the paper? And we ended up not doing it. In this case, our editors decided that the top editor, finally decided, after meeting with the president and his national security team, that we would write about the prisons. We would say they're in Eastern Europe, but we wouldn't name the countries, because the agency and the president argued that those countries might be subject to retaliation. But more than that, really, their argument was our liaison services, our foreign partners overseas in the intel world won't trust us if they don't think we can keep a secret. And so we did that. We didn't put the names in. It still caused a big hoopla in Europe. There were investigations for about a decade.
Still continuing.
Still continuing. That's the give and take of a responsible dialogue, I think, between the two. I did, however, notice in your book that you were able to write an awful lot about these foreign relationships, and not in a general way.
And
Naming people, naming countries. It was, for someone who's lived under this
Listen
regime,
to Dana, buy the book. It's a lot of stuff in there.
Well, if you're interested in intelligence, it's definitely something that you should look at, because, for me, who've lived under this mantra of we can never talk about liaison relations, I don't know how you got that past the review board And what is it, but more than that, what does it really mean? Does it mean that our relations can survive these sort of
Well,
revelations?
so this is good, and I know you want to get to questions, Doctor, but you asked one earlier about transparency and where we're going and do we have to be more, so this is a natural link up to what you just said. And I said we don't need to be transparent to the Europeans. Frankly, the Europeans know more about American espionage than they know or will ever know about their own. Period.
Because they have bad reporters who aren't
Well,
bugging
they,
them more.
they actually have far more restrictive laws.
Yeah.
Right? But we are, frankly, the most transparent intelligence enterprise on the planet. So, but I'm going to agree with Dana. We need to be more transparent. I just want to remind you where the line of departure is. We're already very transparent. And it's not to keep the Europeans happy. I already told you about them. It's to get legitimacy from you. All right? We always operated under the presumption that if you knew everything you were doing, you would broadly agree with what we were doing, that we would be validated by your judgment. Now, I got some wing nuts over here, I got some wing nuts over here, I'm not talking to them, but I'm talking in general. We would have your sanction. Now, we had a system coming out of the 70s where that sanction was given by the president to 2 oversight committees in the FISA court. And the big deal of Snowden, who is effect, not cause, all right? The big deal of Snowden, after you learned about the 215 program, that's the metadata stuff that the book tells you I started in 2001. NSA thought they were good to go. Right? NSA thought this was right. It's been authorized by 2 presidents. I don't know if you've been following along, kind of different, but they both authorized it. It was legislated in several different statutes and overseen by the committees. And oh, by the way, the committees were actually the strongest supporters of the program. Far more than the administration, and when necessary, overseen by the FISA court. And so the folks out at NSA thinking, hey, all right, it's going to go public. I don't like that, but we're good to go. We got the Madisonian trifecta going here. I got the president, I got the Congress, I got the courts. We're fine. And as it turns out, American political culture had moved out from under the great compromise of the 1970s. And frankly, a lot of Americans, and not the wingnuts, a lot of Americans were saying, what I just said no longer constituted consent of the governed. It may constitute consent of the governors. You may have told them, but you didn't tell me. That's a big deal. And now, the reason the last 25% of the book, Dana, talks about my community, old community, needing to be more transparent, is we cannot survive without your sanction. And if our political culture now demands you to know more about what we're doing in order to get your sanction, we have to accommodate to that. Now, I've got to tell you, in doing that, we're going to shave points off of effectiveness. There's no way of doing this without making us somewhat less effective. On the other hand, we don't get to do anything unless you think it's okay. So we need to move forward in a more transparent way, which might explain why I got to say some things.
I hope that's a trend.
Well, I'm going to end with a question actually related to privacy, and then I'm going to open up a question. And you know, we've avoided privacy not because we want to avoid privacy, because it was about the consequences of foreign policy. But my argument is you can't really easily and neatly separate privacy from foreign policy. And let me give an example of why I think we need to come back to the privacy issue, which we haven't talked about. Obviously, Snowden, we've talked about Snowden. This is not going to be a subject that we're going to be able to discuss here in full, and how Americans are really divided on Snowden, in part because they agree with a lot of this that he said about privacy issues, and not necessarily agree with how he did it or the fact that he violated the law. Put that aside, let's talk about the iPhone and the FBI case, which is something that is obviously in the news. And just allow me just to say a few things to lay it out, and then I want your reactions, both of you, to this. Obviously, part of the iPhone resisted an order from a request from the FBI to provide backdoor access to an iPhone of one of the killers in San Bernardino. And they made a couple of points. One point was that, I think the legal point, which was that it will be precedent, essentially. And the second was that maybe once you go through that track of creating the back channel, it becomes more easily to hack it. And so therefore it'll undermine the security, made both cases. But what I want to ask is if you can separate that from foreign policy, because separate from the precedent domestically, which troubles me, troubles a lot of people, I think it's not just one. That's why iPhone has gotten a lot of support in the public for its case. But let's assume I could trust my government. Let's assume that I can trust my government on meaning.
I wish you wouldn't say that with such a great leap of faith.
But let me say, it's not because I don't trust the process where even if you have the right intent, once the information is out there, somebody could abuse it. And that's the issue. It's not about a trust of the people in government, but you know, the availability of information, the temptation to use it for other things. We know what happens. That's what I mean by it. But I think we have more layers of protection than many countries do. So that I believe. But if I'm an iPhone company or any other company, and the U.S. government is saying I'm going to do this just for this one case of criminal, then China calls me up and says, I got a case of a criminal for you, and I want you to access that iPhone for me. And the Saudis do the same, and somebody else does the same. At what point do I trust? Isn't there a global foreign policy precedent? That's number one. And number two, I trust the government may want to do with that, you know, the big data that it has, that it's going to only access it when it's looking for something specific, that it's not going to be used against an American. But what happens when that big data, unfiltered and unanalyzed, is handed over to another power with access to American phone numbers and emails, as has been reported at least in one particular case, of an agreement, a memorandum of understanding to share. I can read it to you from an LA Times report, 2009, a document, memorandum of understanding between the NSA and its Israeli counterpart, which says that the U.S. government would hand over intercepted communications that have not first been reviewed by U.S. analysts and therefore may contain phone calls and emails of American citizens. So even if we're not using those, are we sure that other countries aren't going to be using those? So those are two. Can you separate the question of privacy? And we're talking about intelligence sharing, which you have to do sometimes to get stuff from the other side. Where do you draw the line? So I want comments from both of them.
Okay. So let me jump in on the footnote. All right, y'all heard what the professor said? All right. Now that sounds dark, and it was played dark by the LA Times. Now let me tell you what that was. All right? That is an arrangement between ourselves and an ally. Actually, let me preface this. Let me tell you what I think that meant. Okay. It's an arrangement between ourselves and an ally where America might have the ability to collect signals, because after all, we're rich, powerful, and global, okay? But not the linguistic or cultural ability to, back to your linguist problem, to actually harvest the intelligence from the signals. And so it is a logical step then that you might want to bend that pipe that is collecting on a legitimate foreign intelligence target, perhaps in that part of the world, bend that pipe so it doesn't have to go all the way back to Eastern Maryland, but you bend the pipe directly to someone who actually can do something with it, a trusted ally. But then, on the off chance that you're intercepting communications between Syria and Iraq, maybe, on the off chance there might be U.S. person data in there, you must insist that the ally signs a memorandum of understanding that they will treat the U.S. person information the same way you are required to treat the U.S. person information. And if they break that contract, you're going to shut off the pipe. That's what that was.
How would you ever know?
That is,
How would you ever know?
We're an intelligence organization.
Dana?
And we're already
What do you
agreed we
think
don't
about
just
that?
spy on bad people. And no, this is really important. And so the natural tendency is, oh my God, they're giving the Israelis my emails. When in reality, the MOU is going the last mile to protect your privacy in an obscure circumstance that will probably never happen.
Dana, what do you think of that?
Well, you know, I don't know that case, but the other question you asked was about the iPhone, so I would be interested in hearing.
Sure. I side with Apple.
You side with
Apple.
Apple.
I think American security.
Okay, we
Right?
have some news here.
Thank you. Thank you.
So there are a variety of questions. There's a constitutional question First Amendment, Fourth Amendment. You can even throw the 13th in there about involuntary servitude. All right?
Could we throw the second in there somehow? And
No,
then
I don't think so. 1, 4, 13. All right? I'm not a constitutional scholar. Somebody else in another department around cross campus debate that. You got a privacy issue. No, you don't. He's dead. He's got no privacy. And besides, it wasn't his phone. I oppose doing this, not because I believe the government can't compel it. I oppose doing it because I think it's a bad idea. I think punching a hole in what apparently is pretty good encryption, otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation, punching a hole in that encryption actually makes Americans less secure. Even though the failure to do that means we're going to lose some ground over here in counterterrorism or counter-criminal activity. The book, it's all shade gray. It's all about trade-offs.
And why would it make us less secure?
Because if I'm the former director of NSA and I'm trying to go up against a really tough encryption wall, and one of my cryptologists comes in and said, "Sir, this is unbreakable stuff, man. It's really dark." But we did discover that someone has been allowed extraordinary access through the encryption. I go, "Thank you, Lord." Because now I may not get in, but I have a higher probability of getting in. And so if you believe what Jim Clapper, the DNI, says, the greatest threat to this country right now is cyber attack, why would you weaken cyber defenses provided by a really good company in order to do this? And when I started this debate with myself, I thought we could get away with doing this and not ending up over here, that this would be a one and done. It's not a one and done. All right, you got multiple court cases out there. You got Jim Comey saying, "I'm going to use it as a precedent," and Cy Vance Jr. up in Manhattan says, "I got 175 of these in a room." And so it's not a one and done. And so quite surprisingly, the former director of NSA sides with industry. By the way, so does the former director of NSA named Mike McConnell. So does the former Secretary of Homeland Security, Mike Chertoff. And oh, by the way, have you heard Clapper or Rogers saying much about this? No, you have not. This is not an intelligence issue. It's a law enforcement issue.
Well, we're going to open up the questions, and we have microphones that can go to people.
Plus
and,
a hacker's gonna
perhaps
take care of it
you can
anyway, right?
you can go. I'm particularly happy, General, that you started off with talking about how you've opposed torture and the question, and ended up with you're on the side of iPhone. That's a very good way to start. Very good way to
always carries with it the element of surprise.
On the screen behind you is the advertised topic of this forum. I request that the General will provide an elaborate discussion on the advertised topic of this forum, namely, please talk about the consequences of cyber spying for the United States foreign policy from Berlin to Tehran.
Yep. Cyber spying makes American foreign policy better informed, and thereby allows our policymakers a greater understanding of the world in which they have to make difficult decisions.
Did you want to follow up?
I was hoping, I came here expecting to hear a half hour on this topic, not just one thing.
Well, I think that a lot of what we have been talking about is that. When we talk about Snowden, when we talk about our relations with Europe, you know.
Yeah, that.
Okay.
No, I appreciate the comment. Yes, right behind you.
Excuse me. General, you've talked about Europe and so forth. You spent a lot of time in Korea. I wonder if you could talk about the lack of intelligence on what North Korea is up to and what your understanding is of what's likely to happen there and the problems in gaining intelligence in that particular region. Thank you.
Very briefly, back to my pyramid, you know, human imagery, signals intelligence. In all the disciplines, North Korea was unarguably the toughest target we faced. It is an incredibly closed society with remarkable oppression of any angle or gap that we might be able to take advantage of. You know, our knowledge about North Korea is not zero. We do have the ability along that pyramid to use different tools, but it is and remains an incredibly tough target. In terms of what it is we do on your behalf, it's probably the darkest dark spot we have.
Carla, right there.
Hi, my name is Carla Abdo. I'm a doctoral candidate at the Department of Government and Politics. President Erdogan did state that Turkey did alert the Belgian authorities as to the possibility of an attack, and then they were dismissed. So my question is, to what degree do Western allies and the United States exchange information with, those who are not a member of that bloc? Is there a sense of distrust or a lack of weight, and how could this potentially change?
Yeah, but the sad part is Turkey is part of that bloc. I mean, Turkey's a NATO member, passing information on to another NATO member. And so, that's a very disappointing fact to learn, that the Turks did alert the Belgiques to the individual, and they did not take advantage of it. I think it's more, frankly, I don't think it's a Turkey versus the Union issue. I think it reflects the inadequacies of the Belgian services.
Gary.
Thanks very much, General. I'm Garrett Mitchell, and I write the Mitchell Report, and I want to say at the outset that as a frequent flyer in the Sadat Forum programs, I keep saying to Shibley, you're not going to be able to top the last one, and he keeps doing it, and today was a classic example. So I just want to say to all three of you, thank you very much for a spirited discussion that would do well if we could take a 10-minute break and come back and do another couple of hours. I want to ask a question that knowing precious little about intelligence per se, there was a factoid that emerged from one of the programs this morning that I was unaware of, which was the sort of the brother phenomenon. That in Boston and in Charlie Hebdo and Brussels and elsewhere, we have the brothers, and then it's the question about what's that all about. And that's really not my question, but it leads to this one, which is when I say we, I'm talking about sort of more like us instead of like you. We tend to sort of lump all of these, the San Bernardinos and the Brussels and the Parises, et cetera, together, and it's terrorism, and we have presidential candidates who want us to be quite specific about what kind of terrorism it is. But what I'm interested to know is, in the intelligence community itself, do each of these incidents have, if you will, a kind of fingerprint or profile from which something specific and or new and or strategic emerges that enhances our understanding of the nature of the enemy that we're up against? And connected to that, is it possible that ISIS has developed a capacity of a sort to be able to do that? Because from what I read and what I hear, they're better at the use of technology than their predecessors.
Right. Yeah. That's a great but very complex question. These things have clarity only in the rearview mirror. That's not a cop-out about intelligence, all right? But things become clear only in retrospect, only when you're doing forensics. And, that was obvious. Well, no, it wasn't. It becomes obvious only when you see it that way. And so we're looking at the human condition. And you've got security services like ours. I'll just use ours as the example. Looking at the human condition. All right? But it's very hard. I mean, when does dissent or discomfort or displeasure with one's lot, all right, when does that transfer into something of intelligence value that might be predictive of nature, might be of a predictive nature that someone is going to go do something bad? Now, domestically, that becomes a constitutional question. But even abroad, it becomes an operational question. All right? At what point have you amassed enough in what is a scale, a shades of gray sort of thing, that this one over here just isn't an unhappy monotheist. This one over here has become a danger to his community. And then beyond that, when we look back at these things, because they seem so clear, it seems as if you almost have court of law evidence that, my God, that was beyond all reasonable doubt that that was going to happen, which is never our objective. Our objective, the objective of intelligence, is to enable action even in the face of lingering doubt. Right? But by the way, if you're waiting for beyond all reasonable, we lose. All right, it's too late. I was at a meeting. It was the first Five Eyes meeting after 9/11. We were on the South Island of Australia. And it was the FBI, CIA, and NSA equivalents of the five. Some of them don't have all three, so I think there's a total of 13 that are there. And Eliza Manningham Buller, who was the deputy then of MI5, the British Domestic Service, later became the head. Eliza said it wonderfully. Now, she's from a law enforcement agency, all right? Well, domestic intelligence agency leading to law enforcement. Eliza summarized our task perfectly. How do we prosecute the not yet guilty? That's the complexity of the prosecute not in court of law, but in how do we take action against the not yet guilty? And that's the challenge that we have. And so, yeah, we go to school on these things. One would hope we harvest lessons learned, and we get better at this very amorphous task.
Fatima, where's the microphone? Right here.
Hi, my name is Fatima Keshavarz. I'm an Iranian American, and I've lived a great deal in the Middle East and Europe and here. And I think the last point you just made is something that was on my mind the whole time. How do we prosecute the not guilty yet? And I'm wondering if there is anything beyond prosecution that could be done, because obviously if you're ready to blow yourself up, we're going to get and kill you is not the most effective deterrent. So and I know that the division, labor has to be divided, and that may not be something that you particularly or your division is doing, but I'm wondering what else is being done, because we clearly are not solving the problem by...
Yeah, and prosecute wasn't the right word. It was, how does one act against the not yet guilty? It may not be, not prosecution. But you're right. I was part of and contributor to the most magnificent killing machine in the history of armed conflict, and it still is. All right? And I think Dan is familiar with this, maybe you, Professor. There was a Showtime special right around Thanksgiving. They interviewed all 12 living directors, former directors of CIA. And they interviewed us separately, all right? I mean, they don't, a long time, 4, 5, 6, 7 hours. And then they were a little fearful, oh, what's this gonna look like? But we were all very pleased with the way it came out. And they had 5 of us, the 5 most involved since we were taking direct action: Portergost, me, George Tenet, Mike Merrill, John McLaughlin. And they got us all on camera, separate interviews, separate times. In the last reel of the documentary, all 5 of us said, you can't kill your way out of this problem. Okay, all 5 of us. So we agree totally with, you can't prosecute your way out of this problem. What we can do is buy space and time for policymakers to act more wisely. I'm a bit of a film nut on this. There's an Israeli film that hits this point even harder. It's called The Gatekeepers.
Yeah, I saw that too.
It's interviews with 6 heads of Shin Bet. And these are not shattered men, but they are angry men, because they've done the heavy lifting for the Israeli state, and the Israeli political leadership has not taken advantage of it. And so you've got this, and I'm unapologetic about everything I've done. Right? I felt I did my duty to the best of my ability, and I'm happy with my performance, so to speak. But I realized what I did was necessary, not sufficient. And that we as a nation need to do more about this. Otherwise, and I actually say this in the movie, otherwise people like me get to kill those people forever.
Do you think building walls or the conversation in Europe about strengthening borders is a solution, or
well, you got the Schengen problem in Europe, where they've outsourced their border security, all right? And there's, like I said earlier, there are stresses now. There's monetary stress, there's Schengen stress, and now there's going to be privacy, security stress because they bifurcated decision-making in the union. And it may actually be very, very destructive stress. We as a society have tremendous advantages in this. We really do. I keep saying this every opportunity I get on TV or radio. You know, we are a welcoming society. We know how to assimilate people. We turn people into Americans pretty quickly. All right? Why? By the way, that's a good thing, but it's also a useful thing. It makes us more safe than all of the other Western democracies who have no-go zones or Mullenbecks or big neighborhoods in Birmingham and other cities where the writ of the crown, so to speak, does not extend. We don't have that. We have radicalized individuals. We do not have radicalized communities. We have it fully within our ability to create radicalized communities.
Exactly.
And I fear there are some people out there who are doing their best to create that phenomenon.
With that, I think that's a wonderful way to end because you've scored well here. Started well and ended well. And thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you, Dana. And I'll remind you, there are books for sale, and the General has graciously agreed to sit there and sign a few. And I know there are a number of you who wanted to ask questions. That might be an opportunity at the table also to ask.
Bring it on.
So thank you.
Bring your
book.
book.
Very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dr.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.